He brought people together to solve problems and create opportunities. His legislative style wasn't flashy or over the top. He put his head down and got to work, and he built relationships with colleagues to get things done. Senator Akaka's work on behalf of our nation's veterans also reflected his persistent, effective style. After serving in World War II, Senator Akaka went to college under the GI Bill and became an educator. As chairman of the Senate Veterans Affairs Committee, he was a strong advocate for expanding the GI Bill for a new generation of veterans. He authored the post-9/11 GI Bill, which was signed into law in 2011. Senator Akaka also championed the cause of the Filipino veterans of World War II in Congress. These veterans fought for the United States, but were denied the benefits and citizenship they were promised. Senator Akaka introduced legislation that would restore these veterans' benefits, and with his leadership, this bill passed the Senate. Later, he and Senator Inouye successfully included language in the 2009 stimulus bill that provided one-time payments for these Filipino veterans through the newly created Filipino Veteran Equity Compensation Fund. Senator Akaka also introduced bipartisan legislation to allow these veterans to reunite with their children and families in the United States. While this bill did not pass, in 2016, President Obama, through executive order, established a Filipino World War II veterans parole program to allow the children of these veterans to reunite with their parents in the United States. Some of these veterans have been waiting for decades to reunite with their children. Although Senator Akaka had retired, his insistence on bipartisanship helped to build broad support for President Obama's decision to issue this executive order. Senator Akaka was also instrumental in building support to award the Filipino veterans of World War II the Congressional Gold Medal, which passed in 2016 after years of continued effort. Senator Akaka was also a champion for America's Native peoples and served as chairman of the Senate Indian Affairs Committee. As the first Native Hawaiian to serve in the U.S. Senate, Senator Akaka fought to expand funding for Native Hawaiian healthcare, education, and housing programs. In 1993, President Clinton signed into law Senator Akaka's apology resolution, which acknowledged the federal government's role in the overthrow of the Hawaiian Kingdom in 1893. The resolution's unanimous passage marked the 100th anniversary of the overthrow and was a watershed moment for Native Hawaiians. It served as the United States' first official admission of the role it played in the overthrow of the Hawaiian Kingdom. Later, Senator Akaka worked on the Hawaiian Homelands Recovery Act. This law required the United States to make the Hawaiian homelands whole by ensuring a repayment of lost use of lands originally set aside by Congress, but which were nevertheless transferred to or otherwise acquired by the federal government. The Apology Resolution and the Lands Recovery Act provided the foundation for Senator Akaka's namesake legislation, the Native Hawaiian Government Reorganization Act, often referred to as the Akaka Bill, to establish a process to secure federal recognition for Native Hawaiians to achieve parity with Alaska Natives and American Indians. When I served in the House of Representatives, I introduced the House companion to the Akaka Bill and testified on the importance of passing this legislation in both the U.S. House and the U.S. Senate. Senator Akaka reintroduced the Akaka Bill for more than 10 years, but it did not pass before he retired. A former longtime Akaka staff member reflected on the senator's commitment to the Native Hawaiian community. She said, quote, Senator Akaka worked tirelessly to address the longstanding issues resulting from the overthrow of the Kingdom of Hawaii. He felt strongly that there needed to be a process to bring all parties to the table. These issues remained festering sources of emotional pain that would stand in the way of Hawaii being able to move forward as a state and for Native Hawaiians to move forward as an indigenous peoples, end quote. Building on his work, in 2016, the Department of Interior adopted rules creating a process that could establish a government-to-government relationship between the United States and Native Hawaiians. While the Native Hawaiian community has differences on the issue of federal recognition, everyone can agree that Senator Akaka pushed for the passage of the Akaka Bill because he wanted equity and justice for Native Hawaiian people. Senator Akaka's advocacy for our country's Native peoples could best be summarized in his own words during his farewell address to the Senate. I quote, "The United States is a great country. One of the things that makes us so great is that though we have mistakes, we change, we correct them, we pass. It is our responsibility as a nation to do right by America's Native people, those who exercise sovereignty on lands that later became part of the United States. While we can never change the past, we have the power to change the future," end quote. Many people also may not know that Senator Akaka was just as committed to protecting Hawaii's land and water resources as he was to improving the lives of Hawaii's people. In 1992, Senator Akaka successfully passed his Tropical Forest Recovery Act into law, which served as the basis for federal conservation efforts that protect Hawaii's plants and forests. The senator, as with so many of his initiatives, was much ahead of his time. This act provided a vision and blueprint for tomorrow's conservation ethic, one that stressed the integration of ecology, livelihoods, and culture. In short, an ethic that emphasized sacred relationship between people and place, community, and sustainably managed resources. Senator Akaka also leaves behind a demonstrated commitment to bipartisanship. He was widely known for his faithful attendance at the Senate prayer breakfast every week. And colleagues who attend that breakfast regularly asked me about how he and Millie were doing. During his farewell speech, Senator Akaka said, and I quote, "In Congress and in our nation, we are truly all together in the same canoe. If we paddle together in unison, we can travel great distances. If the two sides of the canoe paddle in opposite directions, we will only go in circles." Senator Akaka is deeply missed by all in Hawaii, and I dare say he will be deeply missed by his colleagues in both the U.S. House and the Senate. And the Mailele is here to signify his devotion and commitment to the people of Hawaii. I now yield the floor to my colleague, Senator Brian Schatz.
Madam President.
Senator from Hawaii.
Thank you, Madam President. I thank Senator Hirono for her poignant remarks, and I'd like to offer my condolences to the family. Senator Daniel Kahikina Akaka died on Friday at the age of 93, leaving behind a legacy of integrity, kindness, and service to Hawaii and to the nation. In Washington, Senator Akaka was an ambassador of aloha. He showed people kindness, respect, and hospitality rarely seen in this town. He didn't just represent Hawaii's interests in the Congress, he showed the world what Hawaii represents. In the words of President Kennedy, all that we are and all that we hope to be. He started that service as a welder in the United States Army Corps of Engineers. He fought in World War II in the Pacific arena, traveling to places like Tinian and Saipan. When World War II ended, he took advantage of the GI Bill to attend the University of Hawaii and to become a teacher, an occupation that he never fully left behind. Senator Akaka served for 36 years in the Congress, in the House, to here in the United States Senate. He was loved both parties because he was kind to everyone. In fact, he never said a bad word about anyone, not even in private. The foundation for his kindness came from his faith, which he learned from his mother, Annie. He was a faithful attendee of the weekly Senate prayer breakfast where he would lead members in singing hymns. He always began with the history of each song, a tradition he passed on to our own chaplain, Chaplain Black, who continues it today. Danny Akaka was also very humble. There were times he didn't get credit for the work that he did here because he didn't care about the credit. He cared about the work, about making a difference for people, especially those that he represented. He was deeply convinced that the government could improve people's lives because he had seen that in his own life as a beneficiary of the GI Bill. He would become the senator to modernize that bill, bringing it into the 21st century. He always fought hard for veterans, for their benefits, for their recognition, no matter the color of their skin or their country of origin. Once, when someone challenged him on the cost of benefits for veterans, he answered by saying, and I quote, "The price has already been paid many times over by the service of the brave men and women who wore our nation's uniform." Senator Akaka never forgot the costs of war on our country, and he did everything he could to make sure that his colleagues didn't either. He voted against the Iraq War and advocated for peace and nuclear non-proliferation throughout his career. Danny was unrelenting when it came to the causes that were most important to him. As the only Native Hawaiian to ever serve in the United States Senate, he never stopped working to see Native Hawaiians recognized in a government-to-government relationship with the United States. In his years on the Indian Affairs Committee, including as the chairman, he successfully sponsored the Apology Resolution, which recognized that the overthrow of the Queen and the only monarch in the United States was illegal and facilitated by agents of our own federal government. This was the theme of Senator Akaka's career, to advocate for people who did not have power, for people who were vulnerable. He was a champion for the federal government employees who continue to this day to be a punching bag for some. He sponsored the 2012 Whistleblower Protection Act, which ensures that federal workers cannot be retaliated against if they report waste, fraud, and abuse. And that was just one of the many things that he did to make the federal government a better employer. Senator Akaka also fought for consumers. He helped people who were trying to get out of credit card debt. He made sure investors had an advocate at the Securities and Exchange Commission. And he protected people who sent remittances around the world so they aren't swindled out of their hard-earned money. Every morning, he would begin his day by meeting visitors from Hawaii. Those connections to his constituents, to home, drove his work and kept him focused on helping Hawaii. But much of his work was possible because of the bipartisanship and the relationships that he built with other senators. Some of his best friends in the body, Senators Inhofe, Cochran, and Barrasso, were people with whom he did not agree very often. Every member of this body, those who knew Senator Akaka and those who didn't, can learn from his legacy, a legacy of quiet leadership, of treating others the way you want to be treated, and of focusing on the things that matter to the people that we are here to represent. I want to end with a few words from Chaplain Black. This is what he had to say about Senator Akaka, and I quote, "There's something called ethical congruence. It refers to when your actions back up your rhetoric. And most of us struggle with that because it's very easy to say something, but much more difficult to live it. There's a verse in Scripture that says we are living letters, so our lives should be something that people should be able to read. Francis of Assisi said, 'Preach the gospel everywhere you go. When necessary, use words.' Senator Akaka preached the gospel everywhere he went and very rarely had to use words. That's the kind of ethical congruence that he had. The United States Senate and our country would be better off if there were more leaders like Danny. He fought for the vulnerable, promoted peace, and looked for common ground. Most of all, he embodied the aloha spirit and showed us all what it means to have a pure heart and be a true public servant. Our thoughts are with the family of Senator Akaka today, with Millie, his children, his grandchildren, and his great-grandchildren, and his staff. He will be remembered and greatly missed. I yield the floor. Suggest the
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander. Mr. President.
Senator from Georgia.
Mr. President, is the Senate in a quorum call?
The Senate is in a quorum call.
I'd ask unanimous consent the quorum call be
Is there objection? No objection, so ordered.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, on the 23rd day of March, 2018, just a little over 2 weeks ago, Zell Bryan Miller of the state of Georgia, former member of this body, former governor of the state of Georgia, former United States Senator in the state of Georgia, former chairman of the Democratic Party in the state of Georgia, an 86-year-old Georgian who had contributed immensely to his state, passed away in his beloved home of Young Harris, Georgia, in Bryan County, Towns County. I'm here to pay tribute to Zell and his life and his contributions to our country, both on a purposeful reason as far as a fellow member, but also a very personal reason for me, because he's an individual who I met through politics, became one of my best friends through politics, became somebody who probably had more of an influence personally on my life than anybody else I know in public service. But as I said, Zell died in Young Harris, Georgia, home of Young Harris College. So Zell Miller was, first of all, a teacher and a writer. He wrote over 10 books. He taught. He was educated at the University of Georgia, taught at Young Harris College, always taught throughout his career. Even as governor and lieutenant governor, he was an instructor and a teacher. He was professorial, but he was tough as nails. There was only one way to do it, and that was the Zell way, we used to say, and Zell knew how to get it done. He was 4 terms as lieutenant governor of Georgia, then ran for governor in 1990. I happened to be his opponent in 1990, and I'm going to get to that in just a minute. He won that election. It was pretty close. It's gotten a lot closer since then. Pretty soon, when I have grandchildren, I'm going to be telling them all I won that thing. It was that close, but so far that's not the case. But he won it, and he was elected twice as governor of Georgia. As governor of Georgia, he embraced education as a major issue, and as I said, he was a teacher and was all about teaching. And he did something nobody's ever done, and some numbers that are very impressive. He created what was known as the Hope Scholarship, funded by Georgia Lottery. A lot of lotteries have been passed, and a lot of liquor referendums have been passed by basis of promising people the money was going to go to education, but they never really did. But in Georgia, the way it was done, and it came out of the debates that he and I had in that race for governor, when we finally passed the constitutional amendment to allow legal gambling in Georgia, and then passed the Hope Scholarship, which was where the money went, we tied all the money made on the lottery down separately for only 3 things: college scholarships for eligible Georgia students, 4-year-old voluntary pre-kindergarten for Georgia pre-Ks at the age of 4, and technology and innovation, wiring and infrastructure into our public schools. Now, this was in 1990, the election. He was elected in 1990 as governor of Georgia, served 2 terms, but by the end of the decade, the lottery had passed. Since its passage, 1.8 million Georgia children have gotten their college education. 1.8 million. 1.6 million Georgia 4-year-olds have gone to pre-kindergarten voluntarily. Georgia's public schools are wired. They're on the internet. We deliver content through distance learning. It's at the leading edge of technology in public education of any state in the country. Now, a lot of politicians can take credit for a lot of things, but I don't know of anybody who can take credit for 1.8 million college degrees, 1.4 million pre-kindergarten programs, wiring schools for the information technology of the 21st century, and doing it all based on a personal effort and commitment to see to it the more that we're educated, the better the state would be. I said Zell was an author. He was an author. He was a Marine. Served went in the Marine Corps from 1953 to 56. Wrote a number of books about the Marine Corps. Wrote a number of articles about the Marine Corps. He wrote one book called True Core Values. The values he learned in the Marine Corps, which he used throughout his life in education, as a governor, as a father, and as a family man. As a father, his wife was Shirley Miller. Shirley's a wonderful lady, and I got to be with her a little bit 2 weeks ago and during the services. Zell and Shirley are like Georgia's forever first family, not just because they were governor and first lady together, and lieutenant governor and first lady together, but also because Shirley was a partner with Zell. She just wasn't his wife. Shirley worked tirelessly for Zell, worked tirelessly for the state of Georgia, and to this day works tirelessly for our state. And during Zell's more difficult years, the last few years, having the difficulties that he had health-wise, she was right there to be with Zell every single day. Zell Miller came to the Congress of the United States in a very unique way. Paul Coverdell, who had the seat that I hold today, died. Paul was a Republican, was in his second term as a Republican. Roy Barnes was governor of Georgia, a Democrat. And when Paul Coverdell died, Roy Barnes called Zell up, who was then the immediate past governor, and said, Zell, I need you to go to Washington and serve for me. The body's getting pretty close politically up there. We need to make sure a Democrat's in that place to replace Paul. Well, I wasn't involved in the conversation, actually, because I was hoping they were going to call me up, which I'll get to in a minute. But they did later, but they hadn't done it at that time. But they decided that Roy said, Paul, you've just got to do it for me, Governor Miller. You've got to make sure that Georgia stays Democratic. And Zell went on public television and said, I'm going to accept this appointment to the United States Senate to fill Paul's seat, but I'm going to vote like Paul Coverdell. He knew how important Paul's service had been to the state. He knew the conservative movement had taken the state and was moving in that direction. And Zell was a man of conscience and principle who recognized the importance of the United States Senate seat, but I recognized more the importance of the wishes of the voters. And he told Roy Barnes, he told me, he told everybody in the state, I'm going to take it, but I'm going to vote like Paul Coverdell. When that 4 years was up, the finishing that term of Paul Coverdell's, Zell Miller decided not to run again. In fact, he held a press, I was in the United States House at that time, and he had a press conference here in Washington to say, I will not seek re-election. That was in 2003. Well, I got on the phone, called my wife, and said, I'm going to go see Zell. Because he's not going to run, I'm going to run for that seat. That'd be a good way to end my career and make a contribution to my state. So I called Zell and I said, Governor, can I come see you this weekend in Young Harris? He said, yeah, come on. So I got in my pickup truck, which is a good way to drive in North Georgia if you've ever been there. Pickup truck is a standard operating vehicle. Drove on kind of a snowflake morning in North Georgia to the North Georgia mountains in Young Harris and sat down with Zell at the fireplace with Woodrow and Gus, his two dogs, talking about politics. And finally I got around to the subject saying, well, Zell, the reason I'm here is you announced you're not going to run for re-election. I want to know if you have any issue with me running to replace you. He said, put your shoes on, son. You can win that seat, and let me know what I can do to help you. I've never forgotten the encouragement, never forgotten what he said, never forgotten the challenge I felt I had to take the guy that had beaten me for governor in 1990, to make a statement like that when I was going to seek to replace him in the United States Senate 24 years later. It was quite a difference and made a lot of difference to me in my life. Zell is just a unique individual about which there's never been one like him. He was a Democrat the day he was born, and he was a Democrat the day he died. A lot of people remember he wrote a book, A National Party No More, which made a lot of Democrats mad. He spoke at the Democratic National Convention and made a lot of Republicans mad. And then he spoke at the Republican National Convention to be the only elected in history person to speak the keynote address at both national conventions, Republican and Democrat. Not in the same year, but in the same decade. But Zell said what he thought, and thought what he said was right, and he delivered on everything he ever said, and if he ever was wrong, he apologized. In his waning years, or in his latter years, he appointed many of his former opponents to offices of importance in our state. And for me, this is the first time I can publicly say thank you to Zell Miller, who I hope is looking down. I know he's looking down. I hope he's listening to what I'm about to say. But when he beat me in 1990 and I ran to replace Sam Nunn when Sam stepped down in 1996 and lost that seat as well, I thought I was through with public service. Had made my best effort, has done as well as I could, served in the legislature, but couldn't make it to that higher place. Well, in 1996, after I'd run for Sam Nunn's seat, about 2 months after the race was over, Zell called me up in August of 1996 and said, Johnny, I've got a problem. I've got a Republican state school superintendent and a Democratic legislature, and they're fighting like hell. And I can't solve the problem, but if I name you as a school board chairman, then you can come over here and they'll balance this out and get the politics out of it and help solve the problem. I said, well, Governor, I appreciate that, but I know what happens on a school board. You got 11 members of the board, and I'm one chairman. There are 10 other people that vote. You can't change 10 people's mind unless you know who those 10 people are. He said, you tell me who else to appoint. I'll fire the others and appoint the new people. He said, come over to the mansion. So I went over to the mansion, and we sat there with his operator at the telephone desk, and for 2 hours called the people that I knew I could trust and believed in that helped me with public education, to ask them to serve with me on the State Board of Education, take it over and clean up the mess that had taken place, which Zell acknowledged thoroughly. I accepted, he made the appointment, And over 2 years, we had a remarkable time period, in large measure because I thought my career politically was over. So I didn't think about what I was doing as much politically as I thought practically for kids. Zell wanted very much to see public education at the apex of in his career. And so he wanted to make sure in that second term it was. I accepted, he worked hard, we joined together, and to this day, had a great period of time for public education in our state in terms of improvement, cashing in on the Hope Scholarship, and doing all the things that we did later on. I could go on and on and on, except to say this. I've worked with a lot of people, I've known a lot of people, I've never known a better one than Zell Miller. Never known anybody more true to their word, more solid to be counted on, who accepted their oath of office and every responsibility that went with it, who would say they're sorry when they needed to say they were sorry, who'd fight like hell when they needed to fight like hell, and who would never take no for an answer if they wanted you to do the right thing for the state of Georgia. So for me, on this night in Washington, D.C., having gone to the funeral of my dear friend Zell Miller, having shared with his family and many others that loved him as I have over the years during those 2 days in Atlanta, let me just close by saying one of Georgia's greatest citizens and probably our greatest governor, Georgia's first family in perpetuity, Zell and Shirley Miller, will be missed greatly by our state, will be missed greatly by me. But I thank God I had the opportunity to know Zell Brian Miller and learn from him in the best way you can, that's by working for him. God bless you, Zell. Thank you for what you did. And on behalf of the people of Georgia, God bless you and the United States of America. And I note the absence of quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Senator from Georgia.
Ask unanimous consent that the quorum call be vitiated.
Without objection. The clerk will report the motion to invoke cloture.
Cloture motion. We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, do hereby move to bring to a close debate on the nomination of Claria Horn Boom of Kentucky to be United States District Judge for the Eastern and Western Districts of Kentucky, signed by 17 senators.
By unanimous consent, the mandatory quorum call has been waived. The question is it the sense of the Senate that the debate on the nomination of Clara Horn Boom of Kentucky to be the United States District Judge for the Eastern and Western Districts of Kentucky shall be brought to a close? The yeas and nays are mandatory under the rule, and the clerk will now call the roll.
Mr. Alexander, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Bennett, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Corker, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Daines, Mr. Donnelly, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Mr. Enzi, Mrs. Ernst, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Flake, Mr. Gardner, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Ms. Harris, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hatch, Mr. Heinrich, Ms. Heitkamp, Mr. Heller, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Isaacson. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Jones. Mr. Kane. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. King. Ms. Klobuchar. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Lee. Mr. Manchin. Mr. Markey. Mr. McCain. Mrs. McCaskill. Mr. McConnell.